cold-blooded murderer, or a woman trapped in a marriage with an abusive man? A woman who used love as a means to an end, or a woman who was open and honest about who she was, but the men in her life couldn't take that she expected to be treated as an equal?
I got something between my legs that'll make a dead man come. Oh, that. I got something between my legs that'll make a dead man come. Oh, that. I'm gonna turn back my mattress and let you all my springs. I want you to find me, daddy, till the bell do ring. Oh, daddy, I want you to shade and dry.
Hello, my name is Summer, and this is Paying For It. Thank you for being here for episode 24. Today, we will be asking the question, was she a cold-blooded killer that got away with murder, or a woman stuck in a marriage that was more about showing how many he could collect than real love? Was she calculating and plotting his death, or stuck in a marriage she couldn't get a divorce from? Did she get away with murder all because of blackmail? Or was this a desperate last attempt of a trapped and abused woman? We shall talk about that and more on today's episode. But before we get to that, though, some channel updates and changes. Nothing too major, nothing crazy, but I have finally gotten my backlog of the video versions up on Patreon. And so July 1st is the launch of my Patreon. Yeah, I started my first tier on over there called Shadow Show. So head on over there to patreon.com/payingforit. Subscribe and get access to all the video versions of the episodes for just $1, and get access to the new and upcoming video versions early on Sundays. I have some big plans coming up for Patreon that include bonus episodes and content and more tiers to go with that. So we are just getting started here on Paying For It, and I hope you're just as excited as I am. With that being said, though, that means that this will be the last month having video versions on Spotify. At the end of the month, I will go to just having audio only on Spotify, Apple Music, Google, all the platforms that my podcast is on. It's just going to offer the audio version. I think that in the end, this will be a clean way to do things. That way, every other episode isn't locked or what seems like a repeat locked. So, and checking out other podcasters on Spotify and other podcasters, it seems like everyone offers their exclusive content or paid content on Patreon. So I might as well just get on that as well. So that way it'll just look cleaner all together, if that makes sense, I think. So yeah, this is the last month, July to August 1st, I believe. And then everything else will be on Patreon, so jump on over there. Again, patreon.com/payingforit. Subscribe, support me, and Paying For It. It would be amazing. Thank you so much. Also, with that, make sure you are liking, subscribing, following, and leaving a review wherever you are listening from. And yeah, it helps out a lot here on Paying For It. Lets me know you're liking what I'm doing. And yeah, thank you. All right, with the housekeeping stuff out of the way, hello, how are you doing? How has your week been? hopefully you're having a wonderful week, and so far you're enjoying the summer. It is hot AF here in Texas. They had our pool closed for a while. They finally got it back open, and I am determined to go to that pool as much as possible before they close it again. Hopefully they do not. Let's knock on some wood. Honestly, I know I'm sounding a little petty towards my apartment complex, but they are not great. And so, last year, this same time, they closed the apartment or the pools. And I know it's the same time because they closed it right around my mom's birthday. Except last summer, they had it closed pretty much the entire summer. So I'm hoping that is not the same thing this year. I mean, we got it back open. How long we'll have it open is the real question. Anyways, let me not go on a rant about my apartment complex because no one wants to hear that, including myself. It's July, baby, and we are in the heat of it for real. So here in Texas, we have to do things either early in the morning or when the sun sets and it's cooled down like 3 degrees. But not only that, we are in like a heat wave for Texas. It's been hot. So pray for us. We will pray for this Oregon girl who's dealing with this hot ass weather. But yeah, it is not worth going outside in the middle of the day, especially like the 5 o'clock when it's the hottest time of the day and you're just like boiling in your own skin. So, we avoided that. It's like not worth whatever needs to be done. Like you have an errand, you should wait. Anyways, I hope you are enjoying your summer and you're not boiling in the heat as well. And that you're ready for some spicy history because, honey, we got a spicy story today. And so, yeah, let's just get into it. Today's story has it all: money, power, sex, drama, and murder. However, was she a cold-blooded killer who looked as love for more as a business transaction? This woman was run through media, and maybe for a good cause. However, as we pull the layers to this historical true crime, I wonder how you will feel about her choices. What kind of choices would you have made in this situation, in this time period? So with that, you know what time it is. Grab yourself a cocktail, a mocktail, a coffee, whatever you fancy. Today, I got this new cup and it has a handle. And listen, I already know, like, I'm behind on this trend, and also I'm a little embarrassed about this trend, but I definitely got a Stanley with its lovely little handle. And honestly, I really just wanted it for the handle. And so I just have some passion fruit juice in here. We're having a juice day, I guess. I don't know. And I just really wanted to use this cup and show my cup off. But delicious. So whatever you have, I hope you are enjoying it. I hope you sit back and relax and enjoy today's historical story. And yeah, so with that, cheers. And let me introduce you to Maggie Meller. Born Marguerite Alabert on December 9th, 1890, into a poor Persian French family. She was the first born to parents Firmin Alberts, who was a cab coachman driver, and her mother Marie Aranad, who was a housekeeper. Both parents worked for the elite upper class. This allowed for Marguerite to have quick glimpses into the lives of those who had a much more ritzy life than she did. A life that even at her young age, she knew she wanted to be a part of. A few years later, her parents would welcome a second baby, a baby boy whose name is unknown. For the first part of her life, she lived a pretty normal life for a young girl in the late 1800s. That was until tragedy is going to strike the whole family. One day, her mother and father were out either working or running errands or just, they weren't there, okay? They had put Marguerite in charge of her 4-year-old brother. The details of that day are, of course, a mystery to history. However, her brother was sadly hit and killed by a large vehicle while he was in the streets. Her parents, of course, truly devastated by the loss of their son, was unable to cope with this loss. They also couldn't come to move past and forgive their young 14-year-old daughter, sadly blaming her for the death of their baby boy. Because they are unable to move past this and they really truly blame her, they end up sending her to the Sisters of Mary Catholic boarding school. So basically, because her parents couldn't cope with their loss, that was 100%, I'm sure, a very traumatic experience for her as well, like it was her brother. I don't think that Marguerite set out that day to allow her brother to get hit and killed by a car. However, she was young and she was looking after another young child. And something horrible and tragic happens. Okay, so Marguerite finds herself in a boarding house where the nuns find work for her as a domestic servant. It is here that her life turns pretty violent. This is due to the nuns being pretty abusive. The nuns would beat her often, and I don't know if this was the case for everyone that was sent to this particular boarding school, or if it was just known that going to nun schools in this time weren't great. But yeah, they are very violent, and in order to keep her and maybe everyone else in line, they would pretty much beat them. Mind you, this was a school that children were sent to when their parents were done with them. Pretty much this was how parents got rid of their children. So a lot of the nuns weren't kind to the children because they didn't have to be. They knew that their parents wouldn't care. They knew that half the kids there didn't even have parents or even know where their parents were. And it wasn't like this was like today's time where you could just get on your phone and be like, hey, mom, dad, this person is whipping me. And even if you could, it's almost like it's almost known that the parents wouldn't have cared. Because if you're getting sent to a Catholic nun school, a boarding school, it was because you were either an orphan, a child who was maybe misbehaving, or just, the parents no longer wanted to deal with you. In her time spent under the quote-unquote care of the sisters of the boarding school, Marguerite develops a sense of independence, learning that she could trust no one but herself. She also starts forging her headstrong personality. Mind you, this is a 15 to 16-year-old girl whose life has completely been upended after the loss of her brother. Marguerite spends a year in this boarding school, and despite the apparent watchful eyes of the nun, Marguerite gets pregnant. Okay, this is the part of the story that boils my motherfucking blood, because first of all, where were these nuns? Were they just sending young girls to rich people's houses without even being there to watch over them? Like, how the fuck did this girl get pregnant? Not only did she get pregnant in a Catholic boarding school where she was supposed to be again under quote unquote care of the sisters, but when it was discovered that she was pregnant, they expelled her and kicked her out. The father of the child still to this day remains a mystery to history. I also can't help but be sad for this young woman who seemed to be failed by all of the people who were supposed to be taking care of her. On top of that, but what were the circumstances around this pregnancy? Like, the whole mystery to this pregnancy is so weird to me. Like, it wasn't like she got pregnant in the school, and if she did, then we should be looking at whoever the man was residing around that area or in that school. But what I'm assuming is that because she was they made her be a domestic servant, they were sending her to affluent houses who probably had men in those houses, and one of them may or may not have taken advantage of her. I mean, I just worry that, like, what circumstances did this happen, even if they aren't bad? She was still 15, you know, she was still a child. In my opinion, something about this screams, something not good here happened. But maybe that's just me. You let me know how you feel. Anyways, she gets kicked out of the Sister Mary's boarding school. From what I can tell, she is kicked out while pregnant. She could not return back to her parents' childhood home. She was now truly alone in this world with a child soon to come. And this was a world that would be very cruel to young pregnant single women. You know, pregnancy before wedlock was a big no-no. For a while, it looks like Marguerite drifts around, gives birth to a daughter named Raymond. And when she can't find work to take care of her and her daughter, she sends her off to be raised and live on a farm in central France. Don't know exactly how this comes about, like if she knew these people or if this was something like a place that you could send children, like similar to a boarding school. I'm not quite sure exactly how this happens, but we know she sends her to a farm in central France to live. At this point, while still drifting, she is introduced to women who find their living by selling love by the hour. She studies these ladies for a bit when she decides that this, in fact, was her ticket to a better life, not only for herself, but her daughter. This is where she turns to sex work to make a living. She starts at the bottom, of course, though she doesn't stay there for very long before she meets a woman who takes her business to a whole new direction. So at 17 years old, Marguerite turns to sex work to support herself and strive for a better life. She starts off at the bottom as a streetwalker. She would often attract men by performing in clubs and bars. She was known to be good at understanding and being able to spot the richest man of the night. It is also said that she not only knew what man was the richest, but also had the ability to be able to be the one to leave with him that night. Marguerite had an understanding for the business and the head for it as well. I say that because she was strong, independent, and didn't let the stigma of the job weigh her down. And again, this is in France, and they had a little bit of a different outlook on ladies of the night. So a little bit more positive outlook, but still not that great, you know? So she knows that a lot of money could be made within this trade, and if she played her cards right, she could truly use this to push her life into another class. It is soon that she is discovered by Madame de Nart, who recognizes in Marguerite that she had what it took. She was smart, independent, and of course, a beauty. So Madame de Nart takes Marguerite under her wing and into a brothel. This is the high-class brothel that caters to very, very affluent, rich crowd of men, achieving the status of a high-class courtesan at the age of 16. So this all happens very fast. With some guidance from Madame Donart, soon Marguerite becomes the most sought after woman in the house, attracting the attention of plenty of wealthy men. Madame Donart stated about Marguerite once, "The mistress of nearly all my best clients, gentlemen of wealth and position in France, England, America, and other countries." It was me that made sort of a lady of her. So she's basically saying, like, because I took Marguerite in and honed in on her skills, I kind of mothered her in a way to make her a lady. She's taking all the credit. In 1907, she lands her first long-term situation with a wealthy client. Don't get it twisted. A lot of articles say that she fell in love, all while saying she was still a courtesan during this time. In the same sentence that they say she was in love, they bring into the question her real motive for her quote-unquote love for him. So I repeat, don't get it twisted. Marguerite was a courtesan, getting paid to be a married man's mistress. Now, that's not saying that there wasn't some sort of love there, but it wasn't as if she met this man in the precursor to love, you know? They met while she was on the job, you know, they met in this brothel, and the whole point of their relationship was always going to be under the understanding that as long as he could afford her time, she would give it. Marguerite met a man named Andre Meller. She was 17 years old and he was 40. Andre Meller was a married, wealthy man who visited the brothel where he was introduced to Marguerite as a courtesan. Now, this is where the affair takes her to the next class of life, because Miller wants her to himself and he's willing to pay for it. Pay for it is exactly what he did, as he buys her own luxury apartment so they could conduct their relationship in private under the guise that they were married. The apartment went under the name Marguerite Miller. I tend to like to pinpoint when exactly our ladies go under alias. I'm assuming that around this time I'm assuming around the time she went into sex work is about the time she started going by Maggie. Although Maggie has many aliases, this will be her main alias for a while. And under this new guise, as a married woman, Maggie gets her full alias, Hello, Maggie Miller. Andre Miller and Maggie will go on to have a 7-year-long love affair where he will introduce her to some finer things in life. One of those things was his stable of horses that Maggie absolutely loved. She fell in love with horses. He also showers her with gifts, jewelry, and a lot of money, allowing Marguerite to start a little nest egg for herself. So by the time their relationship ends in 1913, Marguerite has her own apartment and a solid little savings account. It isn't long before Maggie is moving on to her next big love affair, and that will come in the form of Prince Edward VIII. They are introduced in 1977 by one of Edward's wealthy friends. See, Prince Edward was serving his time in the quote-unquote military with British troops in France during World War I. Now, mind you, his status was way too important, so he wasn't really serving, as he was never allowed into battle nor ever on the front lines. He was just kind of there to say, hey, look, our prince, they always send royalty to serve in the military, but they're royal, so it's not like they're seeing any type of action. He was at the times brought out to visit the front lines once or twice during a time of lull or dull periods. So no way was he going to be in a position to get injured. So yeah, that's why I say quote unquote serving the military, because did he really serve? No. Now, when Prince Edward had met Maggie, it is said that he had already lost his virginity to another courtesan, borrowed from a friend. However, it is rumored, maybe under the guidance of the royal party, that the friend was pushed in or felt that the 23-year-old Edward needed to have a more thorough sexual experience, a full education from a experienced woman. That friend already knew of Maggie and thought that she would be the perfect fit for Edward. So he would go on to introduce the two. They, of course, hit it off and will soon go on to have a very loud and proud and open, passionate 1-year affair. He would often love to show her off in his brand new, very expensive open-top Rolls Royce that they toured Paris in. They had a quick and passionate affair, one that Edward would go on to write several love letters to her. These upwards to 20 letters would come in handy in her life in more ways than one. We will get into the juicy bits of these letters soon. Anyways, though, he's sending her these letters during their love affair. Like a lot of love affairs, it burned bright and hot, then fizzled out just as fast. When he was on home leave in England, Edward sends Maggie all of his love and secrets in these letters. He is making promises to Maggie up until he meets Fredera Dudley Ward, a married woman who stole his interest. Edward forgot all about the woman and the promises he left back in Paris. Maggie, however, hadn't forgotten, nor was she going to lose out on on all this time she put into Edward. Were the acts she was about to commit the acts of a jealous lover, or that of a woman who felt she had been shaded out of money that may have been promised? I can't say for sure due to the fact that, the main details are a mystery to history. However, it is said that for a bit, Maggie would go on to use those letters against Edward to blackmail him. He would go on to send her quite a bit of money for a few months afterward, after their love affair ends. Maggie isn't too upset about the loss of royalty. She will be quick to go back to work, seducing and courting very wealthy men. This, of course, was paying off well for Maggie. Eventually, she will go on to get her first legitimate husband in 1919. Charles Laurent, a wealthy Air Force member, will become her husband for only 6 months before they will divorce, and she will be walking away with a very sizable divorce settlement. The money, honey. Listen, before we judge her, don't. It is not uncommon for girls who sell love by the hour to get into an arrangement like this, to marry for a few months, to in the end get a settlement. I actually know of someone who had a very similar 6 months marriage where from the beginning it seems no one else knew the true meaning behind the marriage, but they did. It seemed like from the beginning it was always supposed to end in divorce. And I feel like for this one, it was very similar. Either way, if it was love or, her job, this money would go on to pay for her new, beautiful, and extravagant property on the desirable Avenue Henry Martin in Paris. She also will be able to buy a stable full of 10 horses, 2 limousines, and servants. She had finally worked her way up to a place that she felt fit for the life she'd always wanted. She was also able to bring her daughter back from the countryside and paid for her to attend the best boarding school in the country. Because again, She lived a life that wasn't fit to be a mother, but she wanted to make sure her daughter was educated and being taken care of. Maggie will continue to work as a high-class courtesan, where she will have affairs with those who could afford her time. Eventually, she will be courting a wealthy businessman when a self-proclaimed Egyptian prince will enter her life. Ali Kamal Fahim Bey will see Maggie across the room one day when he will go on to become a tad bit infatuated by her. They will formally be introduced in Paris society in 1922. He liked to call himself a prince, though in reality he was not an Egyptian prince. He was, though, a very wealthy businessman. So when he was traveling outside of his home country, he would have everyone call him Prince Bey. And I feel like if that doesn't set the stage of what kind of man he is, I don't know what else will, because how often are you meeting a man who like legitimately is telling people I'm a prince, but isn't actually a prince? Hitting it off with this so-called prince, she breaks off her arrangement with the original businessman to pursue this new client. Because again, I think it's really important to remember that Maggie's career was having long or short-term love affairs with men who had enough money to pay for them. So I just think it's important to continue to hit on that fact and remember that she was a professional and this was a potential client, a very, very wealthy potential client who went out of his way to put himself in her company. They hit it off, and he quickly wanted to risk her away to Cairo, where he wants her to get married. Or they hit it off, right? Because it's kind of her job to hit it off with someone who potentially could offer her a lot of money and a new status. So he quickly, though, wants to risk her off to Cairo so that they can get married. In order for them to get married, however, she would have to convert to Islam. We're having kitty difficulties. Come on. Come on. Thank you. Can I just have you on my lap? No. Okay, well, yes, we can share this spot. There we go. That's a good one. That's a good boy. So, like I said, she would have to, in order for them to get married, convert to Islam. And Maggie was willing to do this on the condition that in their historical prenup, she had a couple of clauses put in. One of those was she could wear Western clothing, and 2, she could get a divorce, and because she converted, she would get a divorce settlement. It's almost like, again, this was an agreed upon thing that divorce was the outcome that both of them were expecting. So I would like to point out that again, she is setting the stage for divorce, almost as if it was a part of their plan the entire time. Almost as if she was getting paid to get married. Anywho, at some point without her knowledge, he had the clause allowing her to get a divorce taken out. And he added one of his own, where he was allowed to marry multiple women. So this, again, setting the stage to the type of man this man was. He goes around calling himself a prince to those who don't know him. He also freaking tells her, yeah, sure. Like, he also, like, without her knowledge, takes out her basic protection. This is to protect herself, because even back then she knew like their religion was different and often I don't think allowed divorce at all, and I don't know if they still don't allow divorce. I just know that they're like it was to protect herself. almost as if she was getting paid to get married, and that she knew eventually this would come to an end and she would move on. Except he took it out without her knowledge, and then added some that allowed him to marry multiple women. Now, clearly, this wasn't a marriage of love, and more a marriage for power on both sides. Let's not pretend that it wasn't. He seen something beautiful, new, and he wanted it. But it wasn't the only one he wanted. And he wanted to collect all the beautiful things he could. On top of that, she wanted money. Love was never a big thing for her. Yes, it would be nice to like the person you were fucking, but again, this was a business transaction for her, so it wasn't a total requirement. So, of course, the marriage wasn't one born of quote-unquote love, but more for power and status. Two different kinds of power and status, but power and status nonetheless. Now, let me back up a bit to the historical prenup. Honestly, I don't know what they would call it back then, but that was pretty much what it was happening. I'm almost 100% sure that Maggie would have never gone through with the marriage had she known that he had changed it, specifically taking out the clause allowing her to get a divorce. After the marriage, though, she finds herself in a truly shitty situation, trapped with a man that wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Though she won't find out that she's trapped until much later. The marriage starts off with a lie and only gets worse from there. So, he starts to marry other women. So now he has like a harem, and they seem to fight a lot. And he was the type of man who expected his wives to be subservient and to just do as he says and be quiet and look pretty. Maggie, however, was not the type of woman to do that. She was not the type of woman to bow down to anyone, especially a man, even if that man was her husband. Her husband, didn't care to know or understand the type of spitfire he was marrying. All he saw was shiny, new, pretty, mine, I must have. So she didn't back down nor bow down, and he expected her to do just that. For him, with marriage, that meant you were a subservient to him. So you could imagine quite often that they would fight, and those fights often turned physical. Not only that, but they wouldn't just fight in private. It was known that they were shameless in their fighting in public. It was known that Bay would often state he was embarrassed of her and her inability to submit to him. After a while, Maggie starts growing pretty tired of being abused and disrespected by this self-proclaimed prince. But mind you, she is in a whole different country. She is still in Cairo, and she is kind of trapped there. So she's like growing tired of being abused and disrespected by this self-proclaimed prince, so much so that she starts to document some of the abuse that she was being put through by her husband. A main thing that she documented was her dislike for how he treated her sexually, stating a time that she had been torn due to unnatural intercourse. So, they were having anal. At this time, there was also rumors flying around in Egypt about Bay's alleged homosexuality. This leading her to start building her case for divorce. Her plan seemed to wait and bide her time until she is closer to her home, somewhere she feels is more her turf and safer for her to leave. Okay, so that brings us to July 9th, 1923. The couple and the maid go out to attend the showing of The Merry Widow in London. After getting back to their hotel room, an argument breaks out between the two. Although I wasn't there and we may never know what happened to start the fight, however, we do know the fight between them two begins, and it's a violent one. Eventually, Bay leaves the hotel room for a few hours. Upon arriving back to the room around 2 a.m., 3 shots ring out from their room. Witnesses at the scene of the crime immediately call the police. Upon arriving at the scene, they find Bay shot 3 times with Maggie's .32 pistol that she kept on her to protect herself from jewel thieves. That night, however, she had hid it under her pillow, waiting for her husband to arrive back so that she could draw her gun and shoot him. Bay is rushed to the hospital, but he would die from his injuries an hour later. Maggie would be arrested in what seems like an open and shut case for the police. However, things are going to get a lot more interesting during the trial for murder. Remember when I told you to keep in mind the letters that Prince Edward VIII wrote to Maggie and how they would be a lifesaver in more ways than one? Well, we already know that she was able to blackmail the prince for months before she was able to land her next big clients. Well, they were going to come back and bite him in the ass one more time because she would use them as an insurance policy that they would treat her fairly. See, going into a trial as a courtesan, she knew that she was never going to get a fair trial. Woman of ill repute shoots and kills her wealthy husband in cold-blooded murder. They weren't going to ask her why or even care why. But the why in this case may be the most important part to this whole thing. The why. Okay, so yeah, not a single one of us was alive, nor were we witnesses or even a fly on the wall to be able to say exactly what happened in that room that night. However, I'm going to give you my theory. That night, we know a violent fight breaks out. Why, we aren't sure. However, one violent fight does break out that isn't uncommon for them. Well, my theory is that upon this fight, he went too far one too many times. She's now back in London, very close to Paris, very easily able to get home from this. And she has been already building a divorce case. We know this because she's been documenting some of the experiences that she's been having with her husband. This trips her over the edge, and she asks him for a divorce, when he most likely, unkindly, let her know that she couldn't get a divorce. And he had deceived her, lied to her, and trapped her. So she might as well get used to it and submit to his wants. Now again, this is my theory. This is all alleged. But I believe he was smug. And he probably thought he had gotten her. So he left it for a few hours to let her process that information, most likely thinking he had won. And most likely going out to find a man or another girl to do with what he wants. For her, though, she wasn't about to be trapped with a man because the money was no longer worth it. And this status was no longer worth the abuse and the vile nature of their relationship. So she had come up with a plan. A plan that may leave her in prison or hung, but at least it wouldn't be trapped with a man who lied to her and did things sexually she wasn't comfortable with. Thus, leading us to a 2 a.m. in the hotel room when the gun rings out. Now listen, if anal is your thing, no judgment here. Sex should be sex, but if someone's not comfortable with that, it shouldn't be forced upon them. And it should definitely not be done in a rough way where you're being torn, okay? Ow, I can't imagine. Anyways, before her trial, she starts going to work using those letters to guarantee that she at least gets a fair trial and not just a hit piece on a sex worker, which Still today, it's often the case. See, Maggie was quick to tell her lawyer and the judge she had some love letters from Prince Edward VIII that contained things that she was sure the royal party wouldn't want to be spread all over the front page of the newspaper, but she was do just that if she was left no choice. See, her love letters had Prince Edward talking not very highly or in favor of the royal family. Already, that's scandal. But it didn't end there. He apparently liked to talk a lot. He talked about his feelings on the conduct of the war and rude remarks about his father, the king. Oh, and let's not forget the immensely sexual nature of all these letters as well. This would be a huge blow to the royal family if these letters came out in regards that the prince was the one talking about them to a whore nonetheless. The royal family got the news that there was a woman standing trial who had very damning letters written by Prince Edward, the heir to the throne. The royal family, of course, went right away to pulling strings to make sure that Maggie's past would not be brought up in her trial. Even though it was well known, this was well-known information that what she did as a career. Like, people already knew. However, the royal family made sure that the courts couldn't use it as evidence against her. Because if they used that evidence, she would take the stand and go into great detail about her time and letters with the prince. So on top of the royal family making sure that they did everything they could to keep any mention of Edward and the letters he wrote to her, Maggie also used her fortune to pay the press to run stories that painted her in a light that wasn't just prostitute kills husband. This case gained national regard. People were tuning in fully invested. One, because scandal of it all and woman of the night on trial for murder, people were bored and people were like, even today we love true crime, so this was big news. On top of that, the rumors running amok and rampant about what was happening behind the scenes and the swings and the strings that were may or may not being pulled by the royal family due to these rumored letters. Because just because they weren't actually going to be used in the trial didn't mean the rumors weren't spreading like wildfire back then about these letters. People loved a good scandal, and this was like your ticket to a reality TV show because people were paying for a seat in the courtroom. Wealthy people were sending their servants early to save them seats. Crowds gathered outside to watch. People were invested in this case. In the trial that took place in September 1923, her defense is that Bay was abusive. He lied, trapped her in a marriage she no longer wanted, and wouldn't let her out. On top of the abuse, he wanted things sexually she wasn't willing to give. Thus, not ever allowing her to take the stand as she would have gone into great detail about those letters. And she never took the stand, and her past was never brought up. They focused solely on the case and what happened and why it happened. So when the jury came back, or the judge, I don't know if they did juries back then. Maybe. Well, anyways, they found her not guilty of murder of her husband, and she walked out a free woman, allowing Maggie to go on to live a pretty quiet life after the death of her husband. She returned to Paris, where she would go on to land small parts in movies and continued to charm the pants off of the many wealthy men around her, until eventually she retired as a courtesan and backed away from the public eye. She would go on to live a very full life before passing away at 80, still carrying her late husband's title. Her grandson, after her passing, was able to find that her late lavish life was funded by the settlements of 5 men. And that, my friends, was the story of the good, the bad, and the ugly, but also the glamour, the power, and freedom of Maggie Meller, a woman who was able to succeed in making affairs into business and doing a damn good job of that. What are your thoughts on Maggie Meller and her murder charges? Do you feel that she was unfairly able to use the letters from her past to get out of killing her husband in cold-blooded murder? Or do you feel like many desperate women who were in abusive relationships of this time and saw no other choice? I do not condone murder because, don't kill people, okay? It's not cool. Though this is a totally different time where she legally and religiously got trapped in a marriage that she wasn't allowed to get a divorce. She was never going to be granted the divorce. And it wasn't like she could just leave because he'd find her. And when she realized that he effectively trapped her into whatever he wanted, she would have to do what he wanted, even if that meant continuing to be abused by him to get what he wanted. What were her options other than death? Being her death or his death? Though if you wanted, you could kind of spin her story in another way as well. That she may have showed signs of murderous rage at such a young age. Maybe that's why her parents sent her away, because she seemed like a killer from the start. If I'm being honest, I don't think she was a cold-blooded killer. And I do believe that her brother's death was a tragic accident. Though with her husband, it's hard because she definitely did kill him. But was it justified? Is murder ever justified? Anyways, let me know what your thoughts are. Do you think she should have gotten time for this? Or do you think that because of the circumstances and the time, the fact that she was tricked into a marriage that ended up being super abusive in more ways than one, that she was not able to escape from, was it justified in your opinion? I'd love to know what you have to say about this story. I'd love to know your thoughts on all of it. I'd also like to point out that it was so very glaringly obvious in the articles researching her that every time she got into a long-term love affair that was clearly for money, that the articles and the writers couldn't help but to make it seem as if the men didn't realize what was happening, that they were in love but she didn't retire until way later in life. She never lied about who she was and what she wanted. And I think that's super important to remember because she was a professional woman. She was a professional girl. She was professional. She did the oldest profession, but there are different levels to that game, So a professional courtesan, just like we learned about Cora Pearl, she did the same thing where she would get into long-term arrangements with wealthy men under the guise of sometimes marriage because they were paying her. I don't think it was any different for Maggie. I don't think any of her marriages / love affairs were anything but an arrangement of money. And so, I just didn't like that the articles framed this as if they didn't know her motive. What do you mean? They are meeting this girl in a brothel. They're meeting this girl knowing that she sells love by the hour. So, I don't know. It just again shows the type of way we spin things, even though we definitely made it seem like Bae was a complete victim and that she killed him in cold-blooded murder, which She may have. It could have been rage, and it could have never been her intention. But what would you do if you were in the 1900s and you found out that the marriage that was always supposed to end, you couldn't? Now you're stuck with a man who most likely was struggling with his sexuality in a time that you couldn't be, marrying to a bunch of women who he treated very poorly, and then was telling you, too bad, so sad. I lied to you. I changed the historical prenup and you can't leave. So you might as well just get used to it. I don't know. I don't know what I would have done in that situation. I don't know what anyone would do in that situation. Yeah. So that's that. With that being said, that's all I have for you on this week's episode. Thank you so much for being here with me, and I can't wait to meet again next week. Don't forget to like, follow, and or subscribe depending on where you're listening. Let me know your thoughts on Maggie and if you think she got away with murder. Also, if you're enjoying me and my spicy takes on history, I highly recommend you jump on over to patreon.com/paying for it and get access to the video versions early Sundays. And with that, goodbye.
I got something between my legs that'll make a dead man come. Oh, that. I got something between my legs that'll make a dead man come. Oh, that. I'm gonna turn back my